everybody? Welcome back to Tavian's World of Reptiles. I hope you are all doing well and taking care of yourselves. Right now, we are hanging out with Rumpelstiltskin, my hypo boa here. So recently I was just kind of scrolling through Instagram and Facebook and all that, you know how I do, and something I just see way too commonly, and I think is a rising problem in our community are just really massive body snakes, like unnecessarily massive body snakes, and not breeders. I'm talking by keepers like myself who are just keeping them because we enjoy them and are not looking to make a profit or not looking to breed. These are just everyday people like you and me having huge bodied snakes, and I'm talking like retics the sizes of anacondas that are far too big, and boas with really huge amounts of fat deposits on their body, just like really massive bodied snakes all across the board. And I think this happens because of multiple reasons. One of them being because of how normalized this has become. Like I said, you can literally go on any social media setting, look up any of these species, and you're going to find huge, overweight, over massively sized snakes, just like all over the place. And I think that is becoming an issue because people who are newly coming into this hobby are seeing all of these examples of what people are keeping as snakes, and so naturally they get this thought process in their head that this is the way the snake should look, and so then they kind of come into the hobby and they get a little bit like snobby in the beginning because they're looking at some of the other people's snakes like myself. They'll be like, well, your snake is too thin, blah 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 blah. In reality, what's happened is they've got an image of their head based on all the snakes that they've been seeing all across these social media settings, and this is what they think they're supposed to look like. But the truth is, these snakes are really overweight. And another reason I think this is an issue is because many people are following a lot of breeders. A lot of the bigger names that are in this hobby are breeders, and so people are following them and seeing a lot of their, breeding snakes, and they get this idea that this is what the snakes are supposed to look like. And so now we've got a bunch of private keepers like myself who are keeping their snakes in the same manners that breeders do. And this is where things become an issue. Snakes that are kept by private keepers like myself do not need to be the same level of weight as something like a breeder snake. Now, some people might even argue that the power feeding that breeders do is not necessary either, because, well, they don't do that in the wild. And I was one of those people, to be honest, but I've had to really think about it. The fact of the matter is, one of the biggest pros to keeping snakes in captivity is that we are able to extend their lives while they don't live nearly as long in the wild as they do in captivity. And one of the reasons is because of this kind of breeding process here. We have discovered, or breeders in general have discovered, that snakes too who have a bit more weight on them tend to do better breeding wise, and come out much more healthier in the end than if you just kind of allowed them to breed at their normal body weight. You can usually get some better egg production, as well as, like I said, the snakes just come out healthier in the end afterwards, because it is kind of a long and grueling process to breed the snakes, and they kind of go off feeding for many months and lose a lot of weight, especially the females, because you power feed them and then they still go off food for many months, and then they have their babies or hatch their, like, lay their eggs, and now they've kind of depleted a lot of energy to do that, and then if they're actual egg bearers, then they now have to sit on those eggs normally in the wild for long periods of time and not eating, and they become really unhealthy. So it's understood why snakes in captivity who are bred are actually pumped up to a little bit of bigger size, because health wise it does allow them to come out on top. So that totally makes sense. However, Private keepers don't have to consider these things. Your females are not going to be massively producing eggs and then suddenly depleting lots of energy by not eating for many months. You don't need to do that. So we, as private keepers, are keeping our body snakes in this huge, massive body range, which is usually for snakes in the wild, even if they were in the wild. And snakes in captivity who are bred, they don't need to stay there. They get pumped up to that when it comes time for breeding. And then, when they take a year off, they're kind of back down to the normal size, but then they get pumped up again when it comes to breeding. But we in captivity, like we private keepers, have been kind of keeping our snakes at this massive size as just a way of life, like it's a normal thing, and it's really a big, big problem. I really love to do is watch herping videos because we get to see exactly what these snakes look like when they're out in the wild and compare the body types to them. Now, people again will say, well, this is not accurate. We shouldn't really look at it like that because they don't live as long out in the wild. It's because we feed them more that they live longer in captivity. And I don't necessarily say this is true. I think there are many reasons why these animals live a lot longer in captivity, and us feeding them too frequently is not one of them. For instance, in a wild, if a snake gets hurt, there is nobody there to take it to a vet. If it comes across a snake that has something like a respiratory infection and it catches that respiratory infection, there's nobody there to take them to the vet. There's nobody there to even stop that from happening. Like we do quarantine, we make sure that our sick animals don't come in contact with our healthy animals. We can manage all that. There's nobody to manage that in the wild, so animals tend to pass on transferred diseases and sicknesses a lot more and get ill and die because they don't actually have medical intervention, and either their body can fight it off or they die. It's pretty much the process of the weakest link and only the strongest survive, right? So it is just how it is in nature. But in captivity, we're able to actually monitor that and make sure that our animals are taken care of when they do get sick. And I think that is how our animals continue to live a lot longer than snakes in the wild. Not necessarily because we're suddenly feeding them too common, because honestly I think we do feed them a little more commonly than we really think we need to. The fact of the matter is snakes don't get a weekly feeding in the wild. It just doesn't happen, and yet those same little baby snakes get to grow up to these massive bodied snakes, and that's still with having inconsistent diet, and they still manage to go from a little tiny snake to a 25-foot retic. No, not that one of those have been actually ever found in the wild, but still, even a 12 to 13-foot retic in the wild is still impressive with having such an inconsistent diet. So it is not really our diet that is really keeping them the most healthiest. We might actually be harming them, but it's mostly because we can actually provide them with medical attention. Like I was saying, I like to watch a lot of herping videos. Got off on a tangent there, but I like to watch a lot of herping videos because you get to see their natural body shape, and that's one of the things that really helped me see the reality of this situation. As I like to watch a lot of things like Dave Kaufman's channel. He does a lot of herping. His was one of the first videos that made me really realize it, because he went out to Peru and we got to see some real wild boa constrictors and see their body shape, and he found some pretty good sized ones, and you look at that one, look how healthy and beautiful it looked, and compared to some of the boas we keep in captivity, and yes, they are stunning and they're beautiful, but they are massively overweight, and that is not breeders I'm talking about. I'm talking about privately kept snakes, and this is a problem. We definitely want to rethink the way that we are feeding our snakes. Maybe stop comparing our our private keeper snakes to those of breeders, because breeder snakes have different requirements, body shape, than something like our snakes, who don't really have those requirements. They don't have the responsibility of having to go off feeding because they're breeding and holding babies and all that other nonsense. They just get to be and exist, and I don't think we need to put that much food on them, especially when their bodies aren't actually doing all that extra processing that is needed for that food. So I feel like I'm definitely starting to ramble here, but I really kind of just had those things going through my head. It may not be a very clear thought, but I'm just kind of like the idea of putting up the camera and letting my thoughts just go. And overweight snakes is definitely one that was on my head. And I definitely have had people ask me, like, is your snake overweight or is your snake underweight? And I'm like, nope, my snakes are healthy. My snakes are exactly where they need to be, size-wise, and they're not going to become obese and unhealthy snakes. I refuse to allow that to happen. Now, a tiny bit of spine every once in a while in certain species of snakes is not a big deal, you know, and they don't need to be round. Not no snake needs to be round, and so it's just really a snake by snake basis, and it's all about really doing your research and maybe even looking more into the wild snakes that are out there and figuring out a little bit more about how they actually eat. I wish we could track that more. That's something I would really love to see, is if we could track how wild snakes do, but you know that's kind of like a little bit impossible. But I wonder if it would be possible in any way, shape, or form to get a deeper look into the behavior and feeding activities of wild boas and wild pythons, wild snakes in general, to compare how we are feeding them in captivity. But again, I'm rambling, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video. You all take care. This is TWR. You love yourselves, love your reptiles, love your loved ones, and you guys keep spreading those herbs.